A supreme leader assassinated by a foreign airstrike. A country's holiest waterway shut down overnight. Nearly 1,000 missiles fired in 12 hours. And a war that has already cost American taxpayers over $100 billion, and it's still not over. This is not a movie script. This is happening right now in 2026. In the last 4 months, the United States and Israel have fought a full-scale war against Iran, a war that has pulled in Lebanon, the Gulf states, and now threatens to redraw the map of power in the entire Middle East. If you think this war ended with a ceasefire, it didn't. If you think it's just about nuclear weapons, it's much bigger than that. And if you think oil prices, global shipping, and your own economy aren't connected to what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, you're about to find out just how wrong that is. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how this war started, why it exploded so fast, what's happening on the ground today, and where this is realistically heading next. Stay with me, because this is one of the most consequential conflicts of the decade, and most people still don't understand the full picture. To understand this war, we have to go back to February 28, 2026, the day everything changed. For over a year before that, the United States and Iran had been negotiating. The goal was a new nuclear agreement, replacing the old 2015 deal that had collapsed years earlier. Talks had been going on since April 2025, slowly, cautiously, with both sides testing how far the other was willing to go. But behind closed doors, Israel's Prime Minister was pushing for something very different: a direct military strike on Iran's leadership. After a series of high-level meetings, the U.S. President authorized what became known as Operation Epic Fury. On the morning of February 28th, the United States and Israel launched close to 900 strikes in just 12 hours. The targets: Iranian missile sites, air defense systems, military infrastructure, and top leadership. The most shocking outcome of that first wave: Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed, along with several members of his family and dozens of senior officials. It was one of the most significant leadership decapitation strikes in modern military history. But the strikes weren't clean. A missile also hit a girls' school near one of the targeted sites, killing around 170 people, a tragedy that instantly became part of the global narrative around this war. Within hours, Iran responded, not with restraint, but with one of the largest coordinated retaliations in its history: missile and drone strikes against Israel, against U.S. military bases across the region, and against U.S.-aligned Arab states. And in one of the most economically significant moves of the entire war, Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil choke points on the planet. This is where a targeted strike turned into a regional war. Once the Strait of Hormuz closed, this stopped being a two-country conflict and became a crisis with global economic consequences. Just 2 days after Khamenei's death, Hezbollah, Iran's powerful ally in Lebanon, entered the war, launching rocket attacks into northern Israel. That triggered what's now called the 2026 Lebanon War. Israel responded with sweeping evacuation orders across southern Lebanon, displacing more than 1.1 million people by the end of March. By mid-March, Israel had launched a limited ground invasion into southern Lebanon. On March 24th, Israel's defense minister announced plans to occupy territory up to the Litani River, the same strip of land Israel had occupied decades earlier during the Lebanese Civil War, before withdrawing in 2000. History, in this region, has a habit of repeating itself. Meanwhile, Iran's retaliation didn't stop at Israel. After Iranian strikes hit their territory, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait entered the fray, striking back and clashing with Iranian-backed proxy forces inside Iraq. What started as a U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict had now pulled in nearly every major power in the Gulf. A drone, believed to have been launched by Hezbollah, even struck a British Royal Air Force base in Cyprus, showing just how far the shockwaves of this war traveled. The United Nations tried to intervene. The Secretary General condemned the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes. But the UN Security Council also passed a resolution condemning Iran's retaliatory strikes against Gulf states, a rare moment where the international community found itself criticizing almost every side at once. Let's get into it. Analysts in the US and UK have described Iran's approach as nuclear hedging, building the technical capability to assemble a weapon quickly without actually crossing that final line into weaponization. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has suggested Iran was using its enrichment program as leverage, a bargaining chip it was willing to trade away in exchange for sanctions relief and protection from further attacks. And here's the part most people don't talk about. Israel is widely believed to already possess nuclear weapons, with estimates ranging from 90 to 400 warheads, despite never officially confirming this. Some scholars argue that Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal is actually one of the reasons Iran pursued its own program in the first place, a classic regional deterrence spiral. Israel has consistently rejected international calls to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or participate in talks about a nuclear-free Middle East. And critics argue that the West's quiet acceptance of Israel's nuclear capability, while pressuring Iran relentlessly over its program, has damaged U.S. credibility in non-proliferation diplomacy across the region. This is the uncomfortable double standard sitting underneath this entire war. Now let's talk about why this war matters, even if you've never set foot in the Middle East. The 2026 Iran war triggered the largest disruption to global oil markets in history. When Iran shut the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply normally passes, shipping companies were forced into massive detours, avoiding both the Strait and the Red Sea entirely. Flights in and out of the Middle East were suspended. Aviation companies lost billions. Tourism collapsed across the region overnight. Natural gas and fertilizer supply chains, many of which run directly through this corridor, were thrown into chaos, pushing prices higher worldwide. And for the United States specifically, the price tag is staggering. As of mid-June 2026, the estimated cost of this war to American taxpayers had already reached over $113 billion, and that number has almost certainly grown since. Financial markets swung wildly through the spring, driven by uncertainty over how long the strait would remain closed and whether the conflict would spread further. Even now, with a fragile ceasefire holding in some areas, global shipping routes have permanently shifted, and Gulf countries are re-evaluating who they trust to protect their economic lifelines. This is the part of the war that doesn't make headlines the way missile strikes do, but it's arguably reshaping the global economy more than any battlefield outcome will. Despite the scale of destruction, there have been real attempts to end this war, and they reveal just how complicated peacemaking has become. The first ceasefire came on April 8th, a 2-week pause in fighting. But it came under immense strain almost immediately after Israel launched fresh attacks on Lebanon and Iran refused to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. When peace talks in Islamabad collapsed on April 12th and 13th, the United States responded by imposing a full naval blockade. Since then, negotiations have continued in fits and starts, much of it happening quietly in Doha, Qatar, with Qatari officials acting as mediators between Washington and Tehran. As of early July 2026, both sides have been holding indirect technical talks tied to a memorandum of understanding signed back on June 17th, a framework aimed at formally ending the war. Qatar has described recent progress as positive. The U.S. and Iran agreed to halt direct attacks on each other, and tankers have been allowed to move more freely through the strait, though Iran still requires vessels to follow Tehran-designated shipping routes, a subtle but important way of maintaining leverage without fully reopening the choke point. But peace here is fragile and deeply political. Some of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's own right-wing allies have publicly opposed the Memorandum of Understanding, even as Netanyahu himself has repeatedly thanked the U.S. president for supporting the war effort. At the same time, Israel has made clear it intends to keep pursuing its own military objectives in Lebanon, regardless of what any broader U.S.-Iran agreement says. Analysts have pointed out a real risk here. If a comprehensive deal with Iran is finalized, the U.S. may finally be able to step back from direct involvement in the region. But if Israel continues acting independently in Lebanon, it could end up pulling Washington right back into the fighting, even after an official peace agreement is signed. In early July 2026, something remarkable happened. The war itself paused, not because of diplomacy, but because of mourning. Iran held a multi-day state funeral for Ali Khamenei, stretching from July 4th through July 9th, with ceremonies held across Tehran, Qom, and Mashhad in Iran, and Najaf and Karbala in Iraq. Millions of Iranians turned out for the processions. His coffin, draped in the Iranian flag, topped with his black turban, was carried alongside those of 4 family members killed in the same February strike. Iran's current president called on citizens of every background to attend, framing Khamenei's death not as an ending, but as, in his words, the beginning of a new chapter of national unity and resilience. In a rare moment of restraint, the U.S. president said Iran had been given, quote, a week off during the funeral period, though this pause was clearly tactical rather than purely humanitarian. Iranian military commanders used the same window to issue sharp warnings, cautioning the U.S. and Israel against any, quote, miscalculation during the mourning period, and promising a swift and severe response to any provocation. It was a strange, tense scene, a nation mourning its most powerful figure while simultaneously preparing for the possibility that the war could reignite the moment the funeral ended. Notably, very few major world leaders attended in person. Most countries, including major powers like India and China, sent senior officials rather than heads of state, a sign of just how politically risky open association with Iran's government has become during this conflict. So where does this go from here? A few things are already becoming clear. First, the Gulf states are changing their long-term strategy. Analysts say countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, who found themselves caught in the crossfire despite not being the primary targets, are now accelerating efforts to diversify their security partnerships. Saudi Arabia had already signed a defense pact with Pakistan even before this war. and that kind of alliance building outside the traditional U.S. security umbrella is likely to expand. Gulf nations are also deepening ties with China and Russia, even while maintaining official relationships with the West, a hedging strategy on a national scale. Second, trust in U.S.-led regional security has taken a hit. Even before this war, Israel had bombed Doha, Qatar's capital, in an attempt to target Hamas leaders, an act that reportedly caught the U.S. president himself off guard and drew public criticism from him. For Gulf nations, incidents like that, combined with the broader destruction of this war, have created what one analyst called an unprecedented security crisis, pushing them to question how much they can rely on Washington alone. Third, the core tension hasn't actually been resolved. Iran's nuclear program, the fundamental issue that lit the fuse of this entire war, remains unresolved. A memorandum of understanding is not the same as a final settlement. And with Israel signaling it will continue independent operations in Lebanon, regardless of what Washington and Tehran agree to, there's a very real chance this ceasefire era is temporary. A pause between chapters, not the end of the book. Let's bring this all together. This war started with a single, devastating strike aimed at decapitating Iran's leadership. It spiraled into a multi-front regional conflict involving Lebanon, the Gulf states, and a blockade that shook the global economy. It has already cost over $100 billion to U.S. taxpayers alone, displaced millions of people, and reshaped alliances across the Middle East. And it still isn't fully over. What happens in the coming weeks, whether the Memorandum of Understanding holds, whether Israel keeps operating independently in Lebanon, and whether Iran's new leadership chooses restraint or retaliation, will determine whether 2026 is remembered as the year this war ended or the year it entered a far more dangerous second phase. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening in the Middle East right now, hit subscribe, because this story is far from finished, and I'll be covering every major development as it happens. Drop a comment. Do you think this ceasefire holds, or are we headed for round 2? I'll see you in the next one.